My name is Phreddy Wischusen, and we are going to be talking about makerspaces. And I work at Ponyride, which is located in Corktown in Detroit. And it is a multi-dimensional makerspace. In addition to having metalsmiths and denim smiths and all kinds of other manufacturing outfits, we have a dance studio and a co-working space. So we have people working and creating things in kind of every dimension imaginable. And with me today, I have three very exciting and creative folks, all makers themselves. And I'm going to introduce them. Immediately to my right is Mr. Jeff Sturges, who is the founder of the Mount Elliot Makerspace and the co-founder of OmnicorpDetroit. To his right, Mr. Onyx Ashanti, who is a Beatjazz sonomorph architect. If you don't understand what that means right now, don't worry. You might not by the end of the panel, but you're going to understand something. He's going to share something with you you're going to enjoy. And then finally, to the far right, we have Ms. Brenna Lane, who is one of the co-owners of Detroit Denim, which is a jean manufacturing operation working outside of Ponyride. So I want to ask each of you the same question. I want to ask you to start. If you guys would each tell us what you make and where you make it.
Hi, my name is Jeff Sturges, and for a very long time I was making mostly makerspaces, which isn't the same as making stuff, actually. So facilitating the making of makerspaces actually is quite a lot of work. And only recently have I transferred a lot of that energy into making things. The things that I make are, or at least I'm trying to make musical instruments, electronic musical instruments, and electronic musical instrument experiences that are more intuitive and collaborative and creative, particularly for people who might not consider themselves musicians.
Hi, my name is Onyx. Might be easier just to show you, because it's easier to demonstrate if I can just pull it out of the bag that it shouldn't be in the first place. I make prosthetic sonic systems for kind of neuromodulation that I've been working on the last couple of years. I started doing music, and then it mutated into this kind of neuromodulatory thing, and I use all open source software and hardware and techniques to make it happen.
When you say neuromodulatory, will you just give everybody a hint at what that means for you?
What that means is that because of the information that we're able to have access to on the internet now, I read a lot of research papers on how the brain works, this kind of wave modality of electrical current that moves around on our cerebral cortex. So this is actually a mask, which and these pads are printed with a conductive material that allows me to do a type of neuromodulation called transcranial direct current stimulation, which I use to reinforce a sonic modulation concept that I just came up with a word for it this week. Psychocymatic sonosynaptic reconfiguration. So that's maybe I'll shrink it at some point, but that's what it is so far.
That's awesome. I'm Brenna. I'm one of the owners of Detroit Denim, and we make mainly jeans, along with quite a few other things that you can make on a sewing machine with woven materials. And we're a full cut and sew operation, so we cut, sew, and finish everything in our shop. And we are located in Ponyride, as Phreddy mentioned, which is a kind of makerspace / manufacturing startup incubator.
So, Brenna, why do that? Why make jeans with a bunch of other people around instead of just in your own building?
Yeah, so when we started, none of us have any manufacturing experience. We all had, we knew how to sew at home, but we had no manufacturing experience. And sewing one thing is very different than sewing 20 of one thing, or sewing 100 of one thing, or sewing 100 of 6 different things. So learning about how to manufacture in a more production sense than in just I'm just making this to give to my sister kind of thing it requires a lot of like build out of the space and solving problems. Here's an example. We just got a waistband machine, and we need to hang a roll of denim material above it. And we went downstairs to our friends at the smith shop. They're metal smiths, and we were able to work with them and also a woodworker in the building to kind of stand around this machine and be like, okay, I need it to hang about here. If it's too close, it gets in the way of the sewer. If it's too high, there's too much stretch on it. And it can't be metal, the thing that's hanging it, because the machine rotates so much that it'll shock you if you touch it, so it has to be made out of wood. So those kind of problems are so well solved by having a team of different people who work in different media to be able to say, if we did this with this kind of material, it could solve it this way. So I guess that's a really long way of saying that working in Ponyride allows us to solve our problems for like jigs and guides and like kind of work around way faster with just because of like the breadth of experience that all of the people in that building have. Like I know how to work with fabric material. People know how to work with cement or metal or wood or glass, and I don't know how those materials work, although I'm learning more and more. And having that kind of depth and breadth of knowledge on how materials work, it helps us solve problems that we'd still be years behind if we had to do that on our own. So
Totally. Onyx, you are a solo performer musically for the most part. You don't play in a band, this or that,
Yes.
and yet you've worked in all kinds of weird communal spaces. Will you tell everybody about some of the places that you've worked out of and why you choose to work in those structures?
Well, I tend to remember the idea of makerspaces before they were makerspaces. So it'd be, might be these little hacker get-togethers, and people would bring their stuff, and it's like, oh, you built that. Oh, how'd you do that? Oh, ooh, that's kind of cool. Da 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 da. And then it started formalizing when I think maybe towards the late '90s was when it, San Francisco was a big hub of that as well, and so it started to formalize into a term, makerspace, and that kind of caught on. But I tend to learn pretty quickly if someone can break it down for me. So it's usually my first port of call would be the internet, and then once I've bounced off the walls enough in my own place, then to have a place where there are like minds to kind of have that information swim around with other people who are doing variations or something completely different, but they can kind of explain it in a way where I can understand it. It helps me to kind of reinvestigate my own projects differently, and then to add that into what I do.
Okay, so you guys are both kind of like in line with that there's some way that other people bring things to you might not have gotten yourself. So Jeff, when you've created these maker spaces, how do you make that happen? Like, what is needed to make a maker space so that people feel comfortable sharing together and putting those ideas together?
So I actually use sort of a spiral-shaped model of starting a makerspace, and a lot of people think first, we need space and we need tools and we need supplies. And I think those are obviously three extremely important things, but I tend towards the first most important one, which is, you need people. But I think more than that, you need primarily people that you're pretty sure are going to work well together, that are going to share knowledge, going to respect each other's time and space. And that actually that's hard to get right. So if anybody in the room has actually had a makerspace before, that actually can be a struggle. So sometimes flipping open the doors and saying, come one, come all, that can work, but that can also develop some friction down the line. So what I found to be pretty useful when starting a makerspace and trying to get the right people together is start with either one or preferably at least two people that kind of have complementary skill sets and ideas to develop a little bit more of a vision. And then start maybe hosting events or dinner parties to see if you can find other people that kind of share your value set. Because I think a shared value set and an idea of the culture that you wish to create is important as you start to kind of pick out people that might be prime movers for the space, and then you might start to grow incrementally. That's not to say that opening the doors is not a good way to do things. I think another example of a makerspace who's done that, and I think done it seemingly well, is i3 Detroit. i3 Detroit is a much larger makerspace, and tech shop as well. You pay a membership fee and you can become a member. So there's not really, a vetting of a culture fit before you become a member of those spaces. There may be a vetting afterwards if your culture is so different that that you maybe have to ask to leave. But I think that's a really extreme case. So just to wrap up, my view is it's important to just get your culture and be in touch with what your values are and what you want the space to be like and who you want to be in that space before you're flinging the doors open, and certainly before you're buying tools and space and materials. There is a model of if you build it, they will come, and I think that's true. But if you build it and they come and they're not the right people for you, you could work yourself out of your own space. So there's that.
Okay, I just think this would be entertaining. Would everybody like to share one story about the time where they had a collaborator in their space that was a problem? It just was not working, and how that hampered your creative ability?
That's easy. Even though I'm toning it down today, I tend to talk a lot. And so that's part of my thought process, is that I need to hear it in words back into my own thought process so that I can kind of think about it a different way. So when I'm in a space with other people, there are people, I also tend to be by myself a lot too, but then I just talk to myself just alone. And so when I'm in that type of environment, I need to be around people who can either listen well or are up for that kind of conversational, okay, hey, yeah, maybe the kind of thing. And so I have had instances in these environments where things are firing, and you come over to somebody and, hey, and you can tell that it's really getting on their nerves. And I had a couple of those instances when I lived in Germany. They're not chatty like that. So there are on the more schizo end of the frequency, you get that. But in general, in the makerspaces, people tend to kind of collect in little groups and maybe murmur to each other their little bits of things, and it kind of stays in that pocket, and that just didn't work for me there. So I tended to kind of, there were a couple of spaces where it was that vibe, but they were very infrequent. So that ended up being my main issue in that type of thing.
And Brenna, have you had any issues working in this open space?
Yeah, I'm trying. It's really hard for me to think of a specific thing where I was like, that did not work. But just kind of along the lines of what you were saying, Onyx, is there are interactions where you're like, okay, my criticism of this, of what you've decided to do, which was offered constructively, because we're all trying to vet these ideas, wasn't received well, or maybe I didn't put it well, or I've had experiences where people don't want to offer us constructive feedback because they don't want to hurt our feelings, and I'm so hungry for constructive feedback. I feel like it's kind of like, if you care about someone, you tell them when their fly's down. So you should tell them when something they're making might not be, or at least offer that you have another idea about it, and kind of let them take it or leave it as they will. And I think that Jeff, like you were saying, having everyone on the same page in terms of culture, in Ponyride, there is massive respect for every maker. There's no one in there that I'm like, you're not really a maker. Everyone in there, I'm like, wow, what you do is so cool, and I respect it so much. So when someone does come to me and be like, did you think of this? I'm not in a defensive mind frame of why are you picking apart my idea? I'm like, oh, this person who has this totally awesome alternative perspective from mine is offering me a kind of renewed look at my idea or my piece or my solution or whatever it is. That's so helpful. And I think that kind of mentality, when that's missing, when there's this sort of defensiveness or inability to offer or accept constructive criticism, that can really lead to this breakdown of what is so special about the makerspace, which is that kind of multiple people offering multiple perspectives. So,
and Jeff, you think that the sort of vetting and the creation of finding people who are dynamically resonant with each other is what sort of mitigates that from the outset?
Sometimes. I mean, I don't think it's a clear formula, because I think also doing that can lead to a space that's not very diverse. So, I think I like the idea of having multiple events, prior to telling people you're forming a makerspace, to try to like see what different people are like. I mean, I moved to Detroit and I didn't know very many people at all. So when I started OmniCorp, I actually did throw kind of a wide net. And that did result in some problems, but overall, we got through those difficulties. So I'd say there's, the lesson learned was, maybe we should have had more events to kind of figure people out. But there's also like, coulda, shoulda, woulda, maybe if you did it a different way, the same thing would happen anyways. So I'm not totally sure that, that what I'm proposing is the best way. It's just a way that I would probably try in the future of starting another makerspace. And I'd say I'm sort of using a vague example of OmniCorp Detroit, which is mostly a collection of adults. The other space, the Mount Elliot Makerspace, which is mostly a collection of youth in the east side of Detroit, that became challenging because sometimes we would have problems with volunteers who, would display aspects of, or would discipline kids in a way that we didn't feel was appropriate. And we, the people who had already agreed on the culture of disciplining kids, that we did not share with somebody else. So that's kind of an interesting thing too, is not only being honest with yourself and knowing what your values and your culture are, but sharing them with other people who are coming into the space to see if they, are open to, I don't want to say adhering, but I guess aligning with those values and that culture. And if they're not, maybe suggesting that this place may not be the best for them. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I've heard all three of you say that there is that the emotional, that everybody's personal, every maker's personal emotional health is integral to the functioning of the makerspace. And the functioning and having a multi-dimensional, multi-functioning makerspace is integral to the individual creative process. So, how do each of you sort of work on your own emotional and creative and spiritual engine to allow you to exist in this sort of challenging environment?
Well, what I've found that helps a lot is that, like in the last example, I talk a lot. So knowing that and owning that, it allows me to resonate with people who are on that vibe. So when it's time to do these things, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's get it down. Let's build this thing, because what you're actually doing is that there is the space that you're in, that it occupies, and then there is the space that you project into that space. So, especially if you're the one that might be the point person in that space, you have to project exactly what you are. So if you are brash, if you are condescending, just be condescending. Some people are cool with that. Some people are happy dealing with somebody who's condescending, or somebody who's got to be the funny guy, or somebody who's super quiet, or somebody who just wants to, crunch the numbers and show you what they do and not talk at all. Whichever personality type that is, you have to be that. You don't want to be what someone else wants, your assumption of what someone else wants. Because then you're sending out conflicting messages to people who you might resonate with otherwise, if you were actually just being who you are. And in that space, that starts to resonate. All these minds coming together, knowing who they're actually dealing with, actually creates a space where that creative diversity can come together and create interesting things.
Yeah, Brenna.
Yeah. Wow, you said it so well. I think that's knowing who you are and how you work. And I think when I first started being around Ponyride, I was very, all these people know all these things, and I only know some of these things. And I'm a very self-critical person, and this kind of figuring out, no, I just need to figure out what I'm good at, what I could be better at. And be honest with myself about that, and with the people I work with. Realizing that was so helpful, because it's not, and just to take yourself as you are, not so that you can rate yourself against others, but to just take yourself as you are, to be honest about it and say this is just objectively who I am and how I am. Not to say that you won't grow from that you can improve upon some things, but like an example is that I am not a starter. I am a really bad starter. I get really overwhelmed by like blank page syndrome. Like I know a lot of makers just dive in and they're like, okay, I have an idea, I'm gonna test some stuff out. I get caught in planning world and like I really sometimes need that push to like deal with the anxiety of the blank page or like the uncut material or whatever it is. And I lied about that to myself for a really long time, and I really struggled making anything because of it. And then once I was like, wait, you do this every time. Hey, will you guys make sure that if I'm still here planning after an hour that you guys go, okay, you need to cut some material now. And like knowing myself like that and having people around me who work with me and I work with them for what their pros and cons are character and personality-wise, it's just so much nicer. It's so much more honest, and you get more done when you know thyself. So.
Yeah, I think I probably would just add a little bit more, but self-knowledge is definitely extremely important in a makerspace. Communication is extremely important, because if you don't know yourself, that's communicating with yourself. But if you can't know yourself and express some challenges you might be having with other people or the rest of the space, then you're creating an even larger problem. So I kind of joke that the most important thing you can make in makerspace is make love, which is, you got to be really careful if you're in a youth space and you say that. People think you're a little strange. But the idea is that I try to encourage people to put forth positive energy into the space whenever you can. And if you're in a situation where there's a conflict and you're excited about writing like a really negative post on the entire email list, be conscious that you are all of a sudden taking positive or negative energy that might be directed at one person or a few and that could be resolved amongst that group, and you're throwing it out into an entire pool and really crapping up the waters that way. So it's not only, communicating, knowing it's important to communicate, but it's how to communicate and how to resolve conflicts that I think can continue to actually build good energy. Because if you take the bad energy created by a conflict, but you resolve it, then you're creating more strength and a stronger foundation, and then more positive energy overall, because you've just resolved something and you can share with others how to resolve something like that in the future. Personal energy and the energy you bring to the stage is critical to the group energy, because everybody is sort of bringing a piece of that.
Really interesting. One of the things that I think is a potential problem is the idea that potential makers don't think of themselves as makers. So maybe they come here today and they look around and they see, oh, this guy's building a 3D printer, and oh, I looked at the huge turbine over here, that's interesting. I don't do anything like that, so I don't belong. And yet, one thing that I've learned in being at Ponyride and being around makers is that all kinds of things that I never would have thought of as being made or being important or being innovative, it wasn't until I saw somebody doing it, I thought, oh, wow, that's the thing. So, and you guys have all talked about how diversity of idea sets and personalities really help to make it function. So what advice would you give to help people who don't think of themselves maybe as makers take this step into finding their way into a productive situation?
Well, in the last few years, I've gotten very, very, very careful with words. So once you have a word and then you start infusing it with meaning, it takes on this whole other kind of programmatic association in your mind, right? So maker was just somebody who made stuff a few years ago, but now we've got this kind of momentum towards, makerdom, and that it's all this, and they're, trying to put it back into a priest class kind of a thing. When in reality, using another word, 5 years ago, I was a street performer, right? But technically, I'm the same thing that a street performer is, but now I have a 3D printer and the internet and these things. So I'm able to take what I learned playing on a street corner and apply it with these tools. In fact, there's not really any difference between writing a song and creating things with a 3D printer, because you're inputting data into a computer. One output outputs sound. One output outputs forms. into a 3D printer. It can output robotic data. It can output, something to control something else, or visual data, or whatever. So diffusing that, maybe steering away from any of those words and concentrating on the thing that you want to do is more important. There's a thing at the core of it. And then let someone else call you a maker. Don't call yourself a maker. Just say to yourself, I want this done, and these are the resources that I have at my fingertips to be able to get that thing done. But using the term maker too soon can kind of be a freak out, and it can make you kind of be like, oh, there's so much momentum already going in that direction. I don't know if I really want to, try and be one of those, part of that scene, if it were, So, I tend to kind of stay away from those words as long as possible.
Brenna, you said you were a self-critical person. So what advice would you give to somebody who also might be self-critical and say, like...
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of like losing the label is great, because you don't have to belong to a makerspace or have a tinkering section of your garage or like sell things you make to be a maker. I think it's about the mentality, the relationship you have with the material world around you. Like the dad who, like, his dish rag keeps falling into the sink, so he like takes some plastic he found and like hangs up and makes a thing that he can hang his rag on. Like that's making. That's manipulating the world with what you have around you. Or like, the mom who takes like a pool tube to make the car seat fit better. Like that's making. The domestic making arts are just as much making as like someone who belongs to a makerspace or someone who's taking a making craft and then selling it, or like selling the material good. And they're all doing the same thing, which is like kind of being like, I have an issue, this is what I have to work with, how do I fix it? You know that scene in Apollo 13 where they're like all in the room and he's like, this is everything that's on board that ship, this is our problem, make this work. Like that's like, I think about life like that. Like, what is our problem? What do we have at hand? And how are we going to put these things together to solve our problem? And that, just having that mentality that like you can approach the world like that, I think is a maker mentality. So I don't think people need to, just to understand that you're a maker if you have that understanding. That there's not some like, oh, I'm not a maker yet because I'm not like doing it in a place that's out of my basement or something.
That it's about defying limitations.
Yeah.
Jeff, how do, I thought there was a really nice example about, the Apollo 13 image. How do kids look at their ability to interact with the material world in similar or different ways than adults do?
Actually, in certain ways, I think it's easier with kids because they don't have as much time building up social and familial conventions and limitations and boundaries that I think adults or older people do. So for particularly young people, they're ready for, very young kids, like I've worked with kids from age like 2 and up. Kids who are at 2, the limitation is not imagination, the limitation is physical dexterity. As you get into middle school, it's awesome actually because kids, they're ready for anything and they have the physical dexterity to do just about anything. High school, you start getting into the stage where now they become self-conscious, and whether or not it's cool or whether or not it's going to make money is actually a much higher concern. So that becomes more challenging. And then, of course, when you're adult, it's all of those things and, making a living. So, usually with kids, we are normally putting things in front of them. And I think for adults, to answer your earlier question, sometimes I think that's a good thing too. If you can't conceptualize what you want to do, but you like the idea of being a maker, or let's drop that word and just call it creator, and if you don't have an idea that you want to see exist in the world, then I suggest take any old class that maybe piques your interest at a local community college or a local makerspace or tech shop or whatever. Try something. You might not like it, but you'll just get the feeling of completing something. And it doesn't have to be a physical craft. It could be a writing course. It could be whatever. So.
And am I extrapolating to say that the reason why people might not think that they have any problems they want to solve is only because they don't believe that they have that kind of influence on the world?
I think that's possible. I think that's in fact likely. I think a lot of people don't feel that they have a sense of agency. But honestly, in my view, anything that you put out into the world has an impact in some way. So whether it's the smallest possible impact, but if you've created something, you have put at the very least energy out into the world that is like, wow, I just added something to the world. No matter how insignificant it may seem in the greater scheme of things, I think that's important.
That lack of sense of agency, I think, is one side of it, and it's a very important side of it. And I think that the kind of abutting thing that holds that up is this kind of our consumer culture that says, like, if you have a problem, there's already a solution for it. Just buy the solution for it. I dropped my phone in the toilet the day after I got it, which was a real bummer. And it was soaked through, and I thought, I have to save this thing. Of course, I didn't get insurance. And we were driving to the west side of the state, and I needed a super tiny screw that they don't sell anywhere. And I went to like 3 different stores trying to find it, and then I was like, well, I'm gonna make it. Like, why am I trying to buy this? I'm gonna make it. And that kind of understanding of, like, I can make my solution instead of your first initial reaction being like, I'm gonna go buy whatever I need for this. That's kind of the other side to the idea of, like, I don't really have agency to create or make. It's like, oh, I'll just buy it, done. You know, so I think that's, yeah, that whole, like, I'll just buy the solution thing, to, like, break outside of that and, like, I'll make a solution of my own. I think that kind of helps get past that, like, I can't.
So, Onyx, I've heard you talk a lot in the past about sort of dealing with this materialistic, overly consumer, self-defeating mindset by, like, creating, by making new protocols. And maybe would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm working on a different kind of a space, because it's just me, and I do like, you know, doing my own thing, but at the same time I want to share what the stuff that I've been learning, basically. And every single time people, when I say, hey, yeah, you should come down, you know, I got the parts, you can build a 3D printer, and they have completely freaked themselves out before they even, oh, no, I'm not a computer genius, I'm not a this, I'm not a that, you must have went to school for this. And I'm like, no, I failed out of math in high school. Well, I didn't fail because I graduated from high school, but I wasn't good in math because it wasn't taught to me well. I played on the street because I liked it, but at the same time, I didn't really have any aspirations for any kind of technical, high-level technical expression. And then the internet came along. And so all of a sudden, I was able to see that there were all of these resources that I could go to, including forums, to learn stuff, and that in reality, that ends up being the first thing that I try to get. If anything, right now, if there's any kind of class that people should be learning right now, it should be Google 101. That's all you need to learn, because once you outstrip Google's ability to teach you the things that you want to learn, you'll probably have enough information to design a new Google protocol. So it becomes this evolving protocol stream. This kind of, the way that I've, for instance, one of the things this year, with all this stuff that I've been learning, it's been interesting to see how they all flow together. So I told myself I'm not going to buy any more clothes. I got this yesterday for playing over here, so that doesn't really count. But not going to buy any more clothes. And pretty much anything that that I need, I'm going to try to find an open source route to getting to it, right? So I made my own shoes out of my 3D printer. Oh wait,
he's got the shoes on right now. He walked all the way. What's the longest distance you've covered in the shoes right now?
I've walked a few miles, but the thing is that the design was such that, because they're made to be kind of biomechanically compliant so that they bend when the foot bends. I tried them in soft materials first, but that hurt instantly in about 20 different places. So going with a more mechanical design helped a lot. And so it was basically going on Google, finding out the biomechanics of the foot, studying things like reflexology, material properties. Nylon is what what the shoe itself is made of, and a new rubber-like material called Ninja Flex is what the soft pieces are made of. And these are things that I can research online. There are people who have, the guys that created Ninja Flex created it because there was another material that preceded it that didn't stick well in the 3D printer. So that was a discussion on Reddit, which is I think it's about to go decentralized, which is great. But oh well, you know, that soft material is very good, but it doesn't stick. And then somebody posts, they're like, hey, I made a version that you can have access to. I'll sell it to you, right? And so now that company is huge. You know, now they're being funded by lots of different people because they made a soft material that, and the recipe for it is online as well. So you can make a variation of it. It's based on PLA, which is a bioplastic made of cornstarch. Now, all the stuff that I just said, I didn't know any of that stuff a few years ago. But all of this stuff kind of keeps folding in on itself. And so now, before the winter, I've got to make winter clothes because I don't have any. So I don't even know what that looks like or what it'll feel like, but I know that I can iterate through all of the steps because I have access to all of this information and a growing idea of how to process that information without trying to look at it through any type of a traditional lens.
I just wanted to jump on that because you were talking about the access to the information, and that's what I think is so important. One of the great things about a makerspace, you have access to these knowledges, and the internet makes that possible too. And I think that kind of attitude of proprietary information, that we're keeping this to ourselves because it was hard for us to get here, and that's what big corporations do, and I guess that's what they need to do to stay competitive, or that's what they tell themselves they need to do to stay competitive, and that's just how it's always been. But I see this shift away from this this is our information, we're keeping it secret, to this hey, I figured something out, everybody let me share it with you, that kind of open source thing. And that same day that I couldn't get that tool for my phone, we went into one of those phone repair places. And I was like, look, I don't really need to hire you to fix my phone. I just need to use your screwdriver. And she was like, no. I was like, but you have it, right? That's the screwdriver right back there, right? She was like, yeah, but you can't use it. And I was so angry. And I was like, okay, I'm spending too much time in Ponyride because the real world doesn't work the way Ponyride does, where you can just go get a tool from someone. So I think that access to the information, and to another extent to the tools, but mostly to the information, is, I see that as being such a shift, and that's what I think the makerspace provides in a lot of ways, and just that understanding you can go find it, you can learn it, you can figure it out. I think that's huge.
Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about that shift, and as you've seen these different, how have you shifted as you've made new maker spaces? How have you let what you learned at the previous incarnations inform what you do in the next one, and inform your own process of making?
I think it's been more, even just getting back to what we were saying earlier about understanding yourself, understanding what you need, and making sure that you're opening up an opportunity for people to talk about what they need and be honest about that. And I think I would even say this is related to less about new spaces and more about the shift of OmniCorpDetroit in particular, where it took us the building was empty when we started. We started our makerspace, which is an Eastern market called OmniCorpDetroit, and we actually put in a couple years worth of time actually just building it out so it would be a suitable workshop for ourselves. And it was amazing that it actually took that amount of time because, of course, most people there, if not everybody, had a full-time job, and then you'd come and you'd work on it at night. So by the time it got there, and we had done lots of parties and public events and all these things, we actually realized that we were spending so much time on fixing up the building and so much time doing things that were really serving other people that we hadn't really cut out the time to serve ourselves. So we actually stopped doing a lot of public events. And this year we have a very small presence in Maker Faire, because we kind of felt bad, but at the same way, there wasn't enough people that really wanted to put a huge showing into Maker Faire And I would say it's a good thing because people are so busy with the projects that they were working on at OmniCorp. And that's what the whole space is for. You know, the space is for, it's a collective space so that you can be individually productive. And while I think it is incredibly important to share, what I also realize is that sharing also takes work if it's done in a larger scale. You know, I mean, sharing is one thing if you're sharing your open source design and your software, and in certain ways that's a bit simpler. But, you know, going to fairs or having parties or having events, you know, to share your work can be very time and energy consuming, and it can be at the cost of actually progress on your work. So if you have a full-time job and you're moonlighting something and now you're trying to add an extra bit of time to kind of offer and share something to others, there's a balance that needs to be struck that, you know, is a delicate one, and it's sometimes hard to find, but I think it's important to find that balance and to work on finding it and readjusting it all the time, which is something that we've been actively doing now. In addition to that, I think it's important to figure out what type of a workspace and environment works for you. For me, actually, if I'm going to do programming or anything that requires a lot more thought work and a lot less hands-on work, I actually can't do that in a makerspace because I'm so easily distracted. So if somebody comes, like Onyx comes and starts chatting with me, I'll go, you know, I won't go crazy on him, but, you know, and you learn also to tell people, to be like, listen, I'm really focusing, you know, please don't bother me right now. But to avoid even having that conversation, I'll generally hole up in my own, you know, office studio or whatever at home to do that type of work. And encouraging people to have the discussion with each other so you don't feel bad or you feel guilty, you know, asking people to not talk to you. But just being, hey man, like I'm going to be busy right now. Can you just not talk to me for 2 hours or whatever? And sometimes it's actually hard to even make those simple requests amongst friends. So I think, you know, again, knowing yourself and learning how to communicate has really been a fundamental important thing, and releasing yourself from a sense of social obligation or family obligation or whatever, or at least trying to understand what it's from so that you can address it appropriately. And, you know, I think that's been healthier overall for the entire Makerspace as a group.
Brenna, will you tell everybody about Eric's red light? I think it's a perfect cat
Our
to this.
other owner, Eric, he's very, very distractible. And which is he's such a lefty. He's like a true lefty. Like he's so floating, and it's a really beautiful thing about him, and also very frustrating for me when I'm trying to get him to get work done. So I replaced one of the light bulbs in his lamp with a red light bulb, and I told him that if he needs to get work done, where if anyone were to interrupt him, he wouldn't be able to continue, that he needs to turn the red light on. And when his red light is on, no one approaches Eric. He has to give us a warning, like I'm going into the red light zone, so we kind of get our last minute questions into him, and then we're like, okay, we know we won't hear from him for an hour. And if he ever like leans up and says, hey guys, we're like, your red light's on, get back. Like he knows now that like red light time for him has. And we were in another sewing shop called Peckham out of Lansing. They're an amazing sewing operation, not a nonprofit. And everybody's door has a red, a yellow, and a green like solo cup. And whichever one you put on top, green means like I'm open, I'm approachable, let's chat. Yellow means like, okay, I'm kind of busy, but if you need to talk to me, like I'm accessible, but it better be good. And then red means like you can't approach me right now. And that's like that communicating, making your needs known so that you can have your needs met. The red light has made Eric 1,000 times more productive. And the thing is like you were talking about, like it's hard to request that of your friends or family or whatever, and it is, but what it does is it makes him so much more available to his friends when later, because he's not half in work mode later and half in play mode when he is working. He's like compartmentalized them and he gets his work done here, and then he can go be social time and have left that all at his desk. So we love the red light.
Onyx, I understand you've lived in some squats. You've been in like you haven't really talked about it, but you've lived in and worked in some wild maker spaces, right? And how did you guys deal with that same? Because you do a lot of programming, kind of the stuff like Jeff does that I would imagine needs a lot of focus. How do you work with that?
Well, you know, usually, you know, I've lived in a few different places. I've lived in a few squats. I've lived in a few places that were, you know, half the time squats are like full-time maker spaces because you have to make everything. Because, you know, this was in England where it's a civil issue rather than a criminal issue. So in England, if there's an empty building and you break in, but you do not, that's unoccupied. You break in, but you change the locks, and it's obvious that no one else has lived there. You live there. There's a whole culture that's just been in their culture since the 17th century. So it's kind of gone down now because they have a massive market for property there now. It's going through the roof. But 15 years ago, people were squatting old mansions, insane asylums, old hospitals, all kinds of stuff, right? So these were just full-time makerspaces. So you'd have to, once you do that, and then you've got to put up your notice that, that there are squatters there. And then you've got to sort out all of the random electrical issues of the building. And then you've got to build, this maybe used to be a kitchen, but now it's going to be a bedroom for 10 people. So now you've got to build that out. And you just had to do it. If you were going to live there, you just had to do it, right? And so then there were squat parties. And so that was the equivalent, but for events. So there'd be like old 10-story office buildings on the just outside of the center of London. And they'd go in and they'd sort out all of the electrical, and then come Friday night, there's 10 sound systems. So sound systems are little squatter tribes who come in with their big van, and they bring in these massive sound systems. And so maybe on one floor there's techno, and then on another floor there's drum and bass, and another floor there's something else. And the entire thing is this constant flow of having to okay, this doesn't exist, or this isn't here, or we need, it would be so cool if we had this. And you just have to do it right then.
So there's no coding getting done on Friday night.
Oh, no, there was coding. Oh, no, there was some serious... In fact, in the Bitcoin space, Amir Taki, he's probably one of the most prolific programmers in the Bitcoin space right now. He's the one who's making sure Bitcoin stays decentralized, right? And he lives in squats in London, in Barcelona, and one other vaguely specific place, but he lives that life. There's another life that entails, and there are a lot of programmers in that space. Usually, with a very libertarian / anarchist bent, but it's like there isn't, like when I used the word priest class before, there isn't I'm so busy over here, can you go take the trash out? No. Okay, you go take the trash out. We're going to go dumpster diving for food. You need to go and get the stuff from over here. We need to get all this because it has to get done, and there is the garbage man isn't going to come because it's a squat. So it tended to be that, and it influences the way you think after you leave that. So it becomes very integrated into how you perceive the world.
All right, we're about out of time, but if everybody will just, we'll start with Brenna, and we'll just come this way. If everybody just wants to share a final thought, I think that would be awesome.
I guess a final thought. Okay. I think that for makers, it's really important to always push yourself to how can I make this better? I think that's something kind of a drive, and that can fuel perfectionism. And another thing that fuels perfectionism is fear of being wrong. And it's kind of the same output, this continual improvement, but letting go of that fear of being wrong or being seen being wrong has been the most important thing for me to develop my maker mentality, is to let go of worrying what other people will think of all of the mistake iterations before you hit your final product. Letting go of that is so necessary. And I guess if anyone is like me, who's always I don't want to put something out there that's not perfect yet, you have to let that go to pursue making and to really pursue the craft. So
beautiful.
I would say probably that the thing that kind of is recursive right now in my head is that Right now, even slightly when you go outside, it seems like it might be the same world that it has been in just maybe 5 years ago. But it's not. It's this kind of exponential thing that's going on. And by the time someone who isn't feeling it actually does feel it, it's like that tidal wave. It's just, it's that thing, and it's kind of hitting you. It's like, oh, the water's rising. Oh, whoa, whoa. And that's what we're in right now. We're in that. I remember, because I'm going to be 45 in September, and I remember when the future was constantly 5 years away. That's over. That future
is now.
The future is now. The future was yesterday. We're in it. We're in the portal, the vortex, whatever you want to call it. So kind of, I would suggest, rather than thinking about terms like control or like, I got to control this or I got to figure out a way to fit, to kind of take a surfing modality that you can't really control it, but you can kind of try to kind of balance yourself enough to kind of flow with it and be ready to make those mistakes and get back on the surfboard and get back on it, because surfers have to practice, and to kind of surf this because that's what a wave is. It is that exponential kind of a curve that kind of loops in on itself. So learning how to kind of surf this thing that we're in is going to be, for those that get into that surfing modality, it's about to be a lot of fun, I think.
Jeff?
I think something that was shared with me recently that I occasionally forget but always need to remember is an article written by a fellow named Jeffrey Walker, and it's called, I'm not going to screw up the title, but something in the nature of sustainable change takes ensembles, not soloists. And he is a jazz musician as well as someone who works in the philanthropic world. But that's definitely something that, when starting OmniCorp Detroit, that was definitely an ensemble. When starting the Mount Elliot Makerspace, which was really a makerspace designed to develop learning and connect communities in a struggling neighborhood in East Detroit, that was something that I would say I more took on as a soloist, because I wanted to keep it really cheap, because it was grant funded, and I wanted to say that one crazy person with not so much money can make a lot happen. And I did that for a while until I totally burned myself out. So I would say that I used two different models for more or less the same spaces or the same concept, and it really underscored the need to form an ensemble. And I think forming an ensemble of people with complementary skills, not people that are the same as you. Like if you're a lefty, find a righty. Because if you just have too many lefties, it will be chaotic, and if you have too many righties, it could be equally as chaotic, but maybe boring. So too boring or too chaotic. So there's some happy medium in the middle, I think, with ensembles, and to me, that's what really and also I think gets your work going. Recently I've started to do a lot more with music, and I was doing a lot of it alone, and started to include other people, and that has really fed a lot of energy into the mix. The other thing I think is really important is listening to your quiet voice. If you feel like something's right, or you feel like something's wrong, or you feel like you really want to do something, you've got an urge to do something, at least spend some time to listen to that quiet voice and reason through it, and then just do it. Because that has been something that I've been learning a lot more, particularly lately as I get older. I'm not quite 45, but I think those are two important things I've really come to learn.
Thank you so much. I'll just jump in there just because I have a microphone and I can. What I heard everybody saying today is that when you focus on one problem, making jeans, changing your brain waves, making a functional makerspace, you wind up you get to see every problem. Every single issue that you look at is a microcosm of the entire universe. And what I heard today, too, is that the process of making really is about self-knowledge. So if I can extrapolate what everybody said, what I heard today was if we work on conquering our fears, if we can learn to love ourselves and get past that fear, then we can do everything that we need to do to collaborate and to be a part of the larger world. That when we choose that one thing to overcome in ourselves, we become accessible to the entire universe. So with that being said,
amen.
Thank you all so much for coming to the 2015 Detroit Maker Faire and to our panel. Have a wonderful day, and remember, whatever you make, it's already beautiful. Thank you.